a lot of what I talk about is taking an infrastructure team and talking to developers, because we really are trying to figure out how do we create rules that don't get in everyone's way. So who here feels that their infrastructure, good part of you, and who here developers? All right, so we're about half and half. This is really a talk that involves both of you. I'm not walking in front. I'm going to have to occasionally walk in front of the screen. Anyway, so who are we? That's us. All right, Bloomberg is unusual. We've been around for a really long time. We operate like scores of startups, hundreds of startups. And there's a reason why. Our main product is a terminal there are about 350,000 of them. And people pay an arm and a leg for these things. They trade on them, they get data on them. This is not a product where everybody logs in and maybe for clicking on an ad or something, you all kind of get the same thing. This is a product about people really needing things to do exactly what they need to do. Lots of money is at stake. They need to remember, understand what things look like from one day to the next. At the same time, we have to keep up with tech because we can't risk things not working tomorrow. And as a result, unlike having infrastructure teams in a company where things are dictated and things are going to go a certain way, we actually have to work very, very closely with our programmers. Because if we don't, the basic job of making money at Bloomberg would just completely fall apart. So there has to be a really tight organizational just bond there. On top of that, Bloomberg people tend to stay at Bloomberg for a really long time. You can make an amazing career at Bloomberg by moving from team to team. If you're curious about something, we want you to explore it here. If you want to go from infrastructure to product to AI, we want you to explore it here. So there's a lot of inherited code. There's a lot of code that other people have written and new people have to understand. And again, we have to make sure that we continue to make things work for everybody. So why was I brought in? Well, before I came to Bloomberg, I was a journalist. I wrote a book called Blind Man's Bluff about submarines and spies during the Cold War. And it kind of sold 1 million copies. Got ditched by its first publisher who swore it would never sell. So there's that. It sort of showed up in the West Wing, and there was that. But mainly, what was important is somebody had the crazy idea that if I could get submariners to tell me secrets about classified information, I could get developers who were being confronted with rules for the first time to not completely freak out, to talk to me about what the problems were. And I knew nothing about anything, guys. I thought maybe they wanted me to write a little documentation. Instead, John Lakos, some of you may know John Lakos, sat down and started teaching me about linkers and loaders and cycles. And I walked home that day and every day for weeks on the phone with my dad, telling him that somebody was going to have to fire me because I didn't understand a word anybody said all day long. I was amazed that no matter who I spoke to and who they were in the company, if I said, tell me why this matters, tell me what you're doing, they all took the time to teach me what I needed to know. To this day, I am amazed at the empathy of the people I work with. And I have really come to care about not making their lives more difficult. So here we come. In the beginning, I thought we were working on a single code base, but really we were working on about 10% of it. They were people who had joined in on something that we called RoboSVN. And the guy who built it, we refer to as RoboCop. It gives you an idea of how old our code base is. But a lot of people wanted to avoid rules. They wanted to avoid time constraints. So they got very, very good at avoiding Robo. So we started reaching into our version of a depackage system. And as time went on, our tools got better. We were consistent. We offered advantages that brought 90% of our library code base into one place. This was all opt-in. And we did it originally by keeping the cost of entry low. But if you now look around and you have everybody in one spot, maybe there were standards we needed to hold on to. Maybe there were rules. Maybe there were things people would tell us were causing them trouble that they would like us to enforce. So they came up with the idea that they were going to create a new team. Instead of the architecture team, which I was under Lakos, we were going to be code governance solutions, originally support. And it was going to be an outreach team. And this team's entire job was going to be to talk to people, to find out what would fly and what wouldn't fly. So we had a meeting. We called it, what did we call it? The symposium, not the symposium. What was Eric's meeting?
Summit.
The summit. And at that summit, we wrote a manifesto. And my contribution to the manifesto were a few simple rules. Be open, be generous, be humble, and most important, ask questions. There are too many people who love to nod when people say, do you get that? It's much more important to just sort of say, well, maybe not so much. Why do you care? What is this doing? What are the problems? So, of course, we decided to make our first major attempt really easy. We were going to decide how we were going to rename our C++ code base. Any of you feel like you would be open to a journalist sort of telling you how to name your code? None. I actually had some hands at ACCU on that one. But we had things we wanted to absolutely accomplish. And what we had done before in our little sort of 10% world, we wanted code that was always unique because Bloomberg lives on shared libraries. We wanted code that would provide at-a-glance metadata. If your library was called transit system, then it should be about transit systems. People should kind of know what this was. Why is that important? Everybody is sharing code. You're inheriting a library that has to do something. You don't want it to become a bit bucket. You're depending on code that has to do something. You kind of want to know what it is. And our code base is massive. There is no such thing as a lookup table here. It's just not going to fly. We want code that is reusable, shareable. And in my little world of 10%, I was basically telling people what they had to do. They would say, Mother, may I? And I would say, sure or no. Now we wanted early and automated enforcement. We wanted to make it so much less of a pain that people actually wanted to be a part of it. And we needed buy-in. And I needed to be willing and able to ask people that even though I'd been enforcing something for about a decade, do they want to throw it all away? And I was kind of sort of convinced that maybe that would happen. What we had in our little smaller world of Robo were John Lakos' idea of package groups. So every library would be 3 letters. And within that library, you would have a division of different packages within the group. And it would always start with those 3 letters. That was your branding. And you'd add 1 to 5 alphanumeric characters. There were also people who just wanted nothing to do with package groups. So we said, okay, you could just name your library anything you want if it starts with 9 or more alphanumeric characters. Because we wanted to make sure that package groups had a chance to catch on. The 3-letter world owned the first 8 characters of everything. And at a certain point, people kept sort of saying, well, I want to name my library train. And I'll make it train util. It's going to pass. And I sort of hated that because it was util, utils, lib, API. So I started asking people just out of sheer boredom, what is the code for? Database access? Let's call it transit DBACC. Oh, you're going to be doing messages. Let's call it, let's do a suffix, SBCMSG. Value semantic types? That's great. Let's use the suffix types. And we started to have this kind of language we were sharing. And the weird thing is I had no idea how well people were taking it until one day somebody in internal systems said to me, I love our code base. It has these clear layers. You always know what's in everything. So it turned out when I offered people the chance to throw all of it away, they were like, no, we never collide with third-party code. We're the only people naming these things this long. And oh, by the way, just tell us what the rules are. There was a lot of almost like an internal grimoire. Our team just knew it. We want the rules easy to follow. We want them easy to find. We want them to be just automatic so that we don't develop and then find out later that we've blown it. And we want you to ask us what we think. We don't want you to just tell us what the world is supposed to look like. That ask questions thing, they really cared about. They didn't care if I asked them questions that were super basic about their code base, as long as I asked them questions. So I was kind of excited. I really thought that after a decade of telling people to do a certain thing, I was going to be really, really embarrassed and have to eat a lot of crow. And instead, I realized this was going to be a process of enhancement, not erasure. People sort of liked where we landed. So, and again, even the people outside the 10% we thought. So I decided I was going to write out what we were going to do. We were going to break this down into smaller proposals. And for each one, I would do research. So before I published a request for comment, I at least had an idea of where it should go. I would then encourage debate. And we had a blast system, we call it B-List, Bloomberg List, where we could send out a newsletter. And we had our own internal sort of C++ experts, we call it the Guild. And we pulled them in. And we really thought we were just getting, and I had the people who frequently came to me with these kinds of problems, and I pulled them in. And we thought we were getting a really good sort of sense of what people needed. So we decided, let's offer people more than they had. Instead of just short names, short package groups, 8, and long names, 9 or more, what if people wanted separators? What if people wanted the idea that you could have a series of namespace identifiers? So each team would maybe own transit or dpackage or CMake or whatever it was that you wanted to own. And then for each, that would be your product. And then for each project, you'd have another name. And then maybe for each architectural use, you'd have another name. But it was actually Steve Downey who came to us and said, well, if you do that, a lot of people are going to be breaking when they try to compile their code, a lot of the users, because what's going to happen is you're going to have ambiguous namespacing. Nobody uses the fully qualified namespace. And so we needed to make sure that everything had a divergent ancestor if we didn't want client code to have surprise breakage. So we came up with this idea that we would register our namespaces. And originally the C++ experts in our midst said, we never needed to register before. Why would we need this? And we sold it as extra freedom. You could have this sort of great system of as many identifiers you wanted to link together. Instead of code names being aptojackie, jekyll, noctis, jupitas, for the alphabet, you would have transit dash, train dash, track dash, SBC, MSG. You could have word separators. But just to keep things from being confusing, so now because these pieces would now be shorter, we really just want you to register. And I never thought anybody would go for it. I really did. I completely thought people would say it is not worth it. But we were kind of surprised and people went along with this idea that they would register the namespaces. And we did the RFC and we had people debate a little bit and it looked like, and it passed. So the next thing is mapping. John Lakos had always said, if you have a library name or a package name, your header prefix, the thing that names your header before your component name, _component name.h, was going to be the name of the library. At a glance, you'd always know where things lived. And people went along with that. And while I was about to go to, okay, how do you feel about length about these things? How should these things be spelled? Should they be alphanumeric? One of my colleagues started to program in, is your code registered? And we had already batch registered everything we could find. So we figured this is going to be easy. Just new people were going to be nudged to register their namespaces. Oh, we were starting with namespaces instead of library names. You'd name your namespace, that would become your library name, that would become your header prefix. And we started hearing from people who had not heard about any of this. Everything was just too easy. We were getting all these compliments and it turned out people just didn't know what we were doing. We were talking in the same echo chamber of people who already knew us and people who already liked us. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be really brave. And I went to somebody, some of you may know from the Standards Committee, Juan Alday, and I said, I want to know who's going to be most pissed off. Give me the guys who are going to hate our guts, and I'm going to ask them what they think about all of this. And he said the quants, definitely the quants. They're going to really be annoyed. They don't want you to do anything they're doing. And these are our really serious, high-powered users of C++. They are coming up with calculations that are fairly intense for people who are doing the kinds of trades that involve new kinds of products and things like that you sort of read about in the papers, right? Somebody has batched all this stuff and made it a whole new thing. And I went to the quants and I said, okay, we're up to namespace naming. What do you think about 9 or more alphanumeric characters, even if we add up all the identifier names? What do you think? Should we go shorter? And they were like, the longer the better. Oh my God, make Bloomberg LP be in front of every namespace so we don't have to worry about our third-party code being confused. And I was shocked. Why would these guys go along with this? They were supposed to hate me. And well, I kind of made a problem. I didn't realize that if I was going back to the people who hadn't heard of us before, I needed to relitigate from the beginning. I kind of was holding on to the idea that we had 2 wins, and I would ask them about this third piece. They didn't realize that we were about to get them to register absolutely everything that they had. And the minute we started to turn on, add a new identifier, must mean a new library, they completely freaked out, and for good reason. I don't even know where we are here. Okay, yeah, they freaked out for good reason because they were using namespaces within their library naming namespaces to organize their code. They would add tons of them, and we were saying, oh, each time you added an identifier, you have a new library here. And they were like, no, we don't. This is how we work. And they called me up and they were furious. And I said, okay, tell me what you're doing. Explain it to me, show it to me. I have to bring it back to my team and sell the idea that we've made a mistake. But they heard talk to me more. They heard debate. They heard, oh, I'm just going to keep blowing smoke. What they didn't understand is how very much I meant it. So it was kind of a crunch. But eventually, we realized that a lot of people were doing exactly what they did. These guys were just the ones who were going to be loudest and more creative about it all. So we realized that we could not have every identifier be part of your library name and part of your header name. We had to sort of say, the first up to this amount, we're going to be what named your library, what named your headers, and the rest we don't even want to know about. Once you've got the 3 or 4 or whatever, or 2 or enough characters that are unique at the beginning, everything you do after that is up to you. We want alphanumeric characters, but you want to do weird characters, that's fine. You want to do caps, lowercase, whatever. It doesn't matter anymore. It's going to be unique. We need to leave you alone. We need to know when to stop. So we did. Instead of telling people they had namespaces and that named their code, we said they had primary package namespaces. So grab a namespace, let that be your branding. Add something, add as many layers as you want to name your package. But when you're done, and that's your library name, and you want to be more creative within there, we are not even going to look. You don't have to register, you don't have to go through any rules, it has nothing to do with us. And this is putting it all together. Ignore that slide. We haven't gotten it all together. What we've realized is, as I've given this talk, and I gave it internally in London, people were still having problems. We thought since we were telling everybody register ahead of time, pass registration, and you never have to, we'll never question you again. People didn't know that. We still hadn't reached out to all those guys. People were kind of getting surprised because they would develop everything and then try to publish and it would all fall apart. So we now are trying a new tool that says the minute you register, you create a repo. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to look and see if you've registered a namespace associated with the repo. And it's going to jog you from the second you start. They also want They just want, so they want to know that things are easy. Then they started coming to me and sort of saying, okay, it's not just that it's too soon. We think you're still making decisions, not talking to us. And by the way, we think the way the code was written 5 years ago is breaking us in ways that you haven't heard. And you're in New York and we're in London, or you're in one building and we're in another, and we need more. By the time I finish talking to people within New York and within London, I have a year's worth of work. And some of it is going to be going to Brett and Steve and saying, we need to change things. My guys need things that are different. They're arguing for new stuff. They're arguing for ways to be handled differently. Somehow along the line, while I was talking, by the way, the quant who was like my biggest nemesis was in the back of the room, and I'd only ever seen him as a postage stamp on Zoom. And I think he actually, for the first time, completely 100% realized that we thought he made our entire process better. And he went around saying, we were highlighted in her talk. He came and saw me at ACCU, and he was doing the same thing. And we decided we like each other much better in person. It just works. So here's my problem. I have been asked to productize this thing. Here, tools automate, do all these nice things. Yes, you have to be open. You have to believe people want to do the right thing. You need to be humble. You need to know what the right thing is. You need to be generous and find out and include the most people who are most likely to avoid you. But how? I want to create a recipe that says every time we hear about something that needs a change, first, how do you get people to keep talking to you? How do you structure your outreach? How do you find out when you're causing more harm than good? Or even that people who you think will hate rules, like the quants, really want rules that help them. So I need to figure out how to do outreach, how to make sure, like one of the things we did is we turned on warnings as errors in our code, and we forgot that a lot of people were like actually programmed to crash on warnings. Like we really needed to do blind testing where we found out who might have gotten a bad warning, but that they before they ever saw it, before it ever touched their world. So if any of you want to talk to me about what you think would make a good outreach program, the kinds of things you wish that you had, now is the time to do it. Because if I can create a product for Bloomberg, I could share it. I could sort of come to you and guys and go, okay, we have this outreach system we think would be really good. And some of you might not come from companies where developers are always oh God, I'm losing words, I'm tired. Where developers are always consulted before infrastructure people do things. But I'm telling you, whether or not that's your setup, we learned a lot. And it wasn't just me. It wasn't just a journalist saying, okay, maybe my C++ is not that great. Because I was surrounded by people who knew a lot better, and we all made these mistakes together. This idea of back and forth talking works. But if I could come up with a way and get you guys to help me to sort of make it sort of a no-brainer, just here's the rule book. Here's what you do when you need to sort of start messing around with people's code, where you need to refactor, where you need to quote Laura Savino, who I love, and who was at ACCU and CppCon, not drop the baby, not grab the thing that doesn't matter, and only go after what will make everybody's lives better. I would love to share that with you guys, but first, maybe some of you want to sort of talk to me and share some of what you think you'd like to see in your worlds. Anybody? I'm not afraid to pick a victim, so, how much time do we have?
20 minutes.
Okay, well, that's what I was hoping. I was hoping we would have a conversation here. So, what do you think? John, you could talk to me about this. For the ability to get the developer community and the infrastructure community talking. We were talking about how important the developers are for great, safe C++. Maybe there are things that you would think that we should attack, that we should have tools that look at, that maybe don't exist right now. Are there topics you'd like us to bring up?
I have worked in some pretty large organizations with lots of programmers, and I can see the issues that you're talking about. But I have been doing training for 10 years, and I'm no longer in a large organization with lots of developers, and I'm not looking back. And I'm glad to not have to deal with that part of the world. One of the things that I do sometimes understand is, let's say I'm installing some new system that I haven't installed before, and what I want is guidelines. It says, oh, you can install this anywhere you want. Well, I want to know, where should I install it, right? Because I don't want to put it where I think makes sense, only to find out later, well, most people assumed you did this. Having guidelines early on, it's nice to have the freedom to do whatever I think is best when I'm the expert. But when I'm the newbie, I'm doing something I haven't done before. Tell me, oh, this is how you should set this up. This is how, these are the directories you should use for this kind of thing. Letting me have that guidance, maybe I'm going to disagree, but when I'm the new guy, I'm not going to disagree. As I'm learning to do whatever it is I'm new at, I'm not disagree then, and I like to have strong guidelines. Okay, this is probably how you should name things, these kinds of things. After I've used it for a while, I might see, oh, look, there's limitations there that weren't obvious before. But having guidelines, having rules to follow that are well thought out, that are made by people who are the experts, it can really be valuable.
And one of the things you just said is maybe later I find some downside to it. That's also important. Whatever we decide, whatever we put in place has to be organic. It has to leave room for finding out we got in somebody's way when there was something really creative that they wanted to do that made sense. There are people who are just being creative for the sense of being creative, and that can create a mess, and things have to be understandable and heritable. The other thing is it's like we want to make it clear that your need for guidelines, you're coming to us as a newbie, anybody, is as important to us as my talking to Brett and Steve, who are brilliant and they're having an idea. It can't all go in one direction. And I mean, people tend to apologize to me. Oh, I'm so sorry I got this wrong. Like you were born knowing this? Like we taught you this in school even? This is all about culture and what works, and it's a back and forth conversation. Yeah.
Like one of the things that John said is guidelines rather than hard and fast rules. So your group says this is the way things should be named, but if some group says, well, we do it a little differently and it works for us, and can you make this exception for us?
Okay, this comes up all the time. No, that's a great question. When we came up with here, it all looks sort of like this. When we came up with this, we were, how long is long? People like the idea of informative names, right? Is long 5 characters, is long 7 characters, is long 9 or more characters. We ended up, because we wanted to automate, we didn't want everybody coming to me the way they did in the little mini version in Robo of our code base. We didn't want everybody coming up and saying, is this okay? It was awful. It was like, they didn't know how I was making these decisions half the time, and they had to wait. So the debate went on, and it turned out, even though I only had sort of control over 10% of the code base, I got to be pretty well known at Bloomberg, and people kind of knew we were doing this. And sometimes people would want the freedom to be able to move into whatever system they were going to be in. So half of our code base, the library code, was 9 or more alphanumeric characters. On something as basic as, do we want to be able to just slide through without having to ask for an exception or having things break and having things change? We decided that the consensus was 9, and we went with half of it. And sometimes the answer is, you know what? We did an RFC for it, by the way. We let people sort of debate it, and that's where we landed. And sometimes, sometimes the answer is some things are going to feel a little arbitrary, but if they're consistent, they may be okay, right? Other people will come to us and basically say, well, we're special. We just don't like this at all. But once we start putting you on exception lists, then it starts to break in other ways, or you may get stopped because there's a new file or something. Like, what's the cost of being different? And what's the cost of just going along? There will be other things, though, that are better with guidelines.
Yes, yeah, that, as you were saying, I was thinking, yeah, some things need the hard rules.
Some things need
And
training.
Other things need more guideline-ish.
Well, I'll give you an example. We used to say, please don't use util and utils. It's making us crazy. We don't let you use lib because a lot of things are prefixed with lib and it makes like simple greps impossible, right? But now if there's a name that I want to go, yeah, that's disgusting, common usage utils, it says nothing. I have nothing to say about it. There was a time when I stopped some poor developer from naming all of his code after monarch butterflies. And because I just felt that somehow it just didn't say anything. I have no leg to stand on anymore. We will teach. Think in terms of not your team, because products move from team to team, but your product is a parent namespace. Think in terms of projects and architectural use, and this is what makes a good name. But honestly, if it's alphanumeric and you count it, we're leaving it alone. Some people wanted to have dashes within the namespace identifiers. But we have code in D package has a dash, and then for header prefixes, we decided we'd take the advantage to have collapsible header trees, so we'd make that into a /. And then for the old library code, that became an underscore, and it was so confusing already. We went with alphanumeric. But so some things we could be really flexible on, and some things we just can't, because it's just too likely to mess up. We have some private code that is handled in a certain way that it turned out if you're not in a certain system, the private code isn't even recognized. People not meaning to can call the private interface, the private implementation rather than the public interface. We're going to start working with the quants on what they need to change there. And that will probably be hard coded because you want to protect against well-meaning people. Can anybody mess up on purpose? Yeah, it's really hard to protect against bad actors. We're assuming people want to do the right thing, right? So we are looking for that too. We are looking for where do you want us to talk to people about what would be best? And where do you just want it impossible to break? And Brett and I talk a lot, and he's the first person to tell me to give this talk in public. I had done it at our little meeting. And sometimes he'll say, well, I talked to the C++ group. And it's like, yeah, but who else? And he comes back to me, and everybody is just trying their best to figure out how do we make this so that we do know that question. When is it a guideline? When is it a rule? When is it something that our static analysis team is going to hard code? And when is it something that it kind of doesn't really matter, but it will make your lives easier? Yeah.
So one interesting aspect about consensus building and setting up guidelines and things is that at a certain scale, there are certain problems that nobody can solve, right? Like team A makes one choice, team B makes another choice, and both teams are fine with those choices. Only team C notices that everything blows up when those two teams make those choices. Right? A concrete example might be a kind of a diamond dependency pattern where one library uses one dependency, another uses another. They're both fine with it in their project workflows. But then somebody makes an application that uses both.
And they crash.
Right. Or ideally the build fails. Yeah, sometimes they ship and crash production.
But that's when I have to ask you, what's actually breaking? What is it a header collision where two things are named the same way, which we're trying to protect against?
You have comments on the role of consensus building and helping teams A, B, and C see that big picture and how they relate are lacking a kind of teamwork that nobody individually would necessarily.
That's actually a lot of what I do.
Yeah.
People will call out, or people need somebody to get off of this old implementation that they're being forced to support because you're moving to a new one. And I mean, I call it looking tough and riding the buses for free. I have no authority to do this, but I still call up and say, okay, this is really causing problems. I really need you to move over. And when can you do it if right now is not good? Can we say it's going to happen in 2 months? Can we make an appointment on my calendar to review whether or not it's happened? There is a lot of just being the big sister in the room or the mama in the room saying, you guys aren't playing nice. And that kind of consensus is something I've always done. No, honestly, nobody has to listen to me. Nobody has ever had to listen to me on most of this stuff. But they tend to, because you come to them, you try to tell them why you're doing something and how to help, and you don't think people are going to drop everything and do something. You're negotiating with people. So that is another smaller form of consensus that we do all the time. It really is just getting people to talk to each other. Yeah.
So I don't have an enormous amount pre-prepared for this, but one thing that I would suggest is, so I work in Ticker Plant, and we have one of the largest code bases within the company that's currently not visible to any of us.
Oh, and it has all of its own rules. I know, guys,
exactly.
I know.
Yeah. So I was going to say, yeah, it's impressively old, and it's just grown up with the company. And so I think that if we can find a way, ultimately we want to move into the same workflow as everybody else. One of the goals of my team is working on taming this code base over time.
I've worked with some of them too.
Yeah, and so I think that we're very interested in moving in this direction, but I think that we'll find every possible way to break this.
We have tools for you that we actually have a little forwarding tool now. It'll take a namespace and create forwarding headers out of the old stuff, give you new headers with the new stuff, and try to make that easy. We're trying to make it so that if something is not registered, it doesn't just sort of say, na, you're breaking. It does it for you. If you can come to me one step at a time, and as you said, you can't just do it off the top of your head and say, okay, let's attack this. I always say do it from the bottom up. What's the thing we could fix first? Then you know that I know that you're trying. There will be exceptions to rules given and grandfathered unless it really breaks somebody to do that. And we just have to figure it out one step at a time. News came to us once when they were outside in the cold. It was a whole other system. And they said, we want to be in the packaging system, but our rules for making the message code had to be, everything was generated according to a certain set of rules, but they had this one non-generated header that was offering IDs. And is there any way we could let them have this one non-generated header? Because the rule at the time was all generated code or all non-generated code. It was the way debug worked. You could, the message code would strip debug, but but it would strip it from everything in the library. So if you had a bespoke piece of code, you would lose it. And we went to the people who were doing the messaging system, and they said, oh, our code generator should make that for you. And that changed. I don't always know what the answers are going to be, but if we can talk long enough, the weird thing is as somebody who frequently knows less about how to create what you've created, I'm really good at getting you guys talking to each other. And I am blessed by the fact that, I don't know, Brett, you'll back me up on this. When I come to you guys, one person in 18 years has looked at me and said, I'm surprised you don't know that. And I still think he's an asshole. Basically, mostly people like to talk about what they're good at and like to work with you to find solutions. And I'm really, really good at asking questions. So would you like to just start next week and just see what we can start doing to help?
It'd be interesting, definitely.
Yeah, first we need to define how much you want to get in with the rest of the system, what you want to get out of it. And then there'll be stuff that's old that really isn't going to hurt anybody, and we'll kind of leave it alone and move forward a certain way. There are people who don't want the old generation and the new generation of stuff. They want our refactoring tools to be that much stronger so that they could now just say, yes, it's all one way. Just don't make, we're happy to do it, keep it consistent. What do we want? Yeah, I'd love to do that. And really, and if any of the rest of you who are not at Bloomberg have ideas about consensus and the kinds of questions that come up and the kinds of issues that C++ would be better with if people were checking for. Again, if I could create a community just outreach outline that we could all share, I think it would be a lot of fun. I'd love to come back and say, okay, here's this first sketch. Who wants to add to it? Are we good? Any more questions or we're done? I'm looking at the time person.
Oh, you're at 5.
I have 5 minutes. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Does anybody actually have this kind of back and forth going on between the people who set the rules effectively and the people who have to follow them? Does anybody not have that?
I just set rules and they put up with me. It's beautiful.
And how would you feel about having people sort of start giving you a little pushback and another view of the world?
I'm old and they just tell me, I get to say, oh, I'm old and wise, and they're younger, and then it works out.
Hey, I'm 63 years old. I try to say I'm old and wise, and not even my kids believe it. So, you know.
They put up with you, but do they actually follow the rules you established?
I don't follow the rules.
What about you, Marshall?
What about me?
What would you like, what kind of input do you want into the process? And you do some work for us too, so hey, you get to actually, you know,
Yeah,
make this count.
I have pushed back on some of the rules and been told, nope, that's the way we do it here.
There is a difference between the team that you are on and the people who have to deal with every other team. I think teams, there are microcultures everywhere, right? And teams may have a very strong sense of this is how we're going to do things. But the flexibility for how everybody else plays together is different. So you probably will not change BDE. They are very set in figuring out, and they will debate the last comma. They will spend hours debating the last comma. But there may be something that you can bring to the developer experience teams, you know, the tech infrastructure teams, that, you know, because we have to get everybody talking, because we have to recognize that we have to embrace these microcultures. We are forced to be flexible the way I have to be flexible with my kids because I'm just not going to win anyway. Yeah.
So I was used to think about internal corporate standards as either carrot standards or stick standards. You know, the stick standards said you have to do this because otherwise management's going to be all over. You have to do it this way. But carrot standards were, well, if you do it this way, then the tools work better. If you do it this way, then the build system works better for you. And so that's what I mean by a carrot standard. It's like, you don't have to follow it, but there's real good reasons to follow it.
There are some standards that are now you're going to break if you don't follow, right? So I guess those are stick. But implementing those, I had a conversation with the person who gave me from contractor way back when I was crying on the phone to dad to permanent desk. And he's now pretty much in charge of a lot of everything we all do. And I have never seen him push anything. He's like, you know, he's so gentle, his touch, and he sort of lets people figure out how it's going to work. We may not be able to say it's always going to be your choice once we've reached consensus on something. But what we can do is say, you know, we really did go out of our way to reach as many people as we could, and this is what your colleagues have agreed to, and there are reasons for it. Other things will never have to be turned on or turned off, and we can sell them as better. But we, at the very least, when some people hear, yeah, the machine, you know, you're going to just throw an error and not go further, but here's how it happened. Here's where it came from. And by the way, if you have a really, really good reason to not make this work for you, I'm working with the messaging team. My next talk that I'm going to offer is just this collaboration between outreach and the messaging team and how they changed all that code. If you show us, if we're wrong, if you can show us that we are blocking something that makes sense, you'll either get an exception or we'll find a way to make it work. Because it has to consistently be that people know that they continue to have a say in it. So if we wanted it too soft, then we'd go back to things just couldn't be automatically allowed and approved, and that becomes a bottleneck. But at the very least, we need to start with the idea that nothing gets put in sand and you don't get beaten up for not being there, unless at the very, very least we can say we did our best to get people to agree to this, and now the automation is going to help. The automated check is going to help. I think people are really glad not to talk to me every time they want to make a new library. You know, I mean, hey, we have database access, service message types layers. It's beautifully layered. But at this point, it's got to be up to the guys and women to decide whether or not they want to keep going or whether or not they want to just completely just use utils and live and keep going from there. Yeah, I'm done?
We're pretty much there on time.
Okay, then I guess thank you very much for coming on a rainy, horrible day.